you want to start with one image, always. And then match that image, and then make the other images work with that image. And I'll show you some techniques on how we did that in the tilt shift. If you get an image that you think has been stitched, or you're having a really hard time matching it with the data that you have, it's always a good thing to check, because those can really cause problems if you try to do a stitched image. When you get into Max, you want to make sure you build as much context as you can. For this particular project, you'll see that we built essentially this pyramid shape here, this diamond shape here, which included 1 or 2 blocks on each side. Building more site and building sort of the longer lines, like the curbs in the site, is going to help you match your perspective better than if you just have your site in the middle of or like if you just had your project site, right? And there's a couple of methods to do this. One is, and I think we showed a little bit of that in the animatic. One is to use the animatic stage yesterday. One is to use Google Maps. The other one is to use OpenStreetMap, where you can actually download vector data and import that directly into 3D Studio Max and start extruding. So let's get into Max. So I'm going to go into a top view here, just to give you guys a little bit of a look on how we started. We had the project site from the client. So we knew what our project site looked like. And we actually went in then in Google Earth Pro, got a nice high-res map of the area, and started to map in, the different blocks. And then we went a little bit further, and we're able to get many of the different context buildings and their general proportions off of Google Warehouse. So with just a few little sort of online queries and searches, we were able to build primarily most of our site. So that gave us sort of a heads up in getting that done. So another thing I like to do when I'm doing view matches is once I start view matching, I actually make all my geometry in my scene very simple when I'm doing the initial 5 to 10 different cameras. I know some people tend to just adjust one camera over and over. I tend to adjust cameras based on moves and what I'm trying to accomplish. So if what I try to accomplish in that next step doesn't work, I can always go back to where I was and start to rethink and start over. So what I did for this particular project was I made just a massing of the roads, because that's what I drew my perspective lines with, or I drew the perspective lines of the roads. So I just made a massing of the roads based on this context model. And then when I started doing my camera match photo, that I was just to the left side of this massing, which is in the model, and sort of in front of this building here. So that's where I started with my camera. Again, like the aerial, I put in a camera, I pointed it towards the site, and this building is that building on the right. So I know that I'm generally in the area I should be. Then the first thing that I wanted to do when I set up this camera then was I wanted to get a little bit better of a horizontal position. So, sorry. I wanted to set my tilt first. So what I did was, between those two cameras, again, V-Ray camera, as you were discussing, with the tilt shift, you can pretty much plug in the numbers, and I knew I took it, so I knew 17 is a good place to start. And then what I use for the tilt shift is this vertical offset. So my initial vertical offset, if you just go back here to 0, this is how it came into Max with the camera and the target level. If I do that negative vertical offset, you see that now it's taking that tilt shift into accountability, and the whole site starts to drop down. But looking at these buildings, this building needs to line up with the orange. This building needs to line up with the red. So I need to do some horizontal positioning and replacement. So I'm going to, my next camera took that into account. So I just rotated the camera and also translate it in the X and Y to start shifting it into the right position. And now you can see that this line here is starting to line up with our orange. And again, as I was saying, that this orange line is my guess based on kind of how big this building is and where it actually falls in the photo, because I can't tell because the tree's in the way, which is a little bit unfortunate. And you can see here that these massings, the verticals are lining up in the correct proportion with the reds. They're not exactly on, but they're pretty close. And then I wanted to, this is the point where I selected the camera and I realized that I was standing on my tiptoes and I should probably adjust the camera just a little bit. So the other camera was at 6 foot. If we look at this one,
9 times out of 10, if you can get a good track, all you need to do is use an auto track. And in PF track, this is where I was talking about aerial footage maybe having a different set of numbers than something like green screen footage. I'm going to start off with a higher candidate number and target number than the defaults. I'm going to probably go up to 200 for a candidate number and 80. What PF track does is it tries to find this number of candidates in the shot as it's tracking, and then it throws out all but the 80 best, so it keeps them. The other thing is I like to try to be quick, and you may notice there's a feature called Show Window, and it will show the size of the item that they're trying to track, and then it shows the window size. This down here, there's a window size and a search range, and so that's what this is representing. And I know, having seen this footage, that it doesn't move very far frame to frame. Even this is where it's moving most quickly. So from one frame to the next. So we can actually, I'm going to turn down the window size down to probably 12, and I can turn down the search range to maybe just 20 for the X and Y. I could even make it, 15 and 25, because I know that I'm only going, in this circumstance, I'm going mostly straight, although these guys over here are moving sideways. So I'll probably just leave it at 20/20 just to split the difference. So that's the show window feature of AutoTrack. And then I'm just going to go ahead and track it. I don't change any of the other features. I've played with them. I haven't really found any reason to tweak them very much. The one key to tracking in general is you want to have parallax. You want to have parts of the scene that are moving differently than other parts of the scene. And that's how the triangulation that the software is happening in the computer is going to be able to really have a lot of data to use to track. Some of the things to really watch out for when doing a track like this. Now again, I did an auto track, and I will show just because it's important. I'm not going to use it when I solve this, but the user track is a really common feature, and it exists in all the tracking software, where this is sort of a little bit more of a manual method, where you pick an item in the scene and you track it because for some reason you know that that's a really good feature. And so here's doing what's called a user track. And you can see over here that if it locks on that object.
Talk about here is the actual solving of the camera lens. So this gives us all our 2D points. And if we switch over to the solver tab here, this is where we get the settings for the camera itself. So just like with PF track, we've got options for unknown constant, approximate constant, and known. The varying would be if you had zooms going on within your shot. You could use those, which, like Neil said, we try to avoid at all costs. I usually like to leave it at unknown constant for the first one, and then if I have problems with the solve, I'll go back and try to manually put in. Usually we know because we are the ones taking the footage what the actual lens is. But again, here in Nuke, I always do approximate. I've never actually done known for reasons like Nils said, if it had been cropped in slightly or anything like that, there is a margin for error there. And then down here we've got some options for quality as well. So the default is low, we're gonna leave it at low. Usually I'll try one at low and see what kind of solve that gives me. For a simple move like this, a lot of times this can work. But for anything that is much faster, you usually want to bump this up to at least medium, if not high, which we have had to do. And you've also got options here for a reference frame and 3-frame initialization, which I've used a lot. So you can actually tell it kind of a frame in your sequence to look at and try to base the solve around. So a lot of times if I have a solve that looks good throughout a lot of it and it slips in one particular area, I'll pick that frame out and use that as my reference frame. And then we'll use a 3-frame initialization around that, so it'll kind of pick 3 points around there. And that'll help kind of solve that area. For now, we'll leave it at the default. And we'll jump back into camera tracker here. We'll hit solve camera. And this will run through and create the actual 3D camera. So that's all set. We've got a pretty good distribution of green points here. We've got some red, which are going to be ones that are not used in the solve. And that's normal. Very rarely do I have one that's all green completely. Usually it has some points that it drops. And then as we get further away in the background here, we've got a lot more orange, which are kind of like mid-range. They have some usable data, not quite as much. And that's totally fine. We've got our site is right here. We've got a bunch of points centered around that. So as long as your distribution is fairly close, I find that to usually work fine. And I'll hit the create scene here. You have an option just to create the camera and output that. But the create scene will actually create a 3D element for each one of these points. And that's going to be important for when Matt brings this data into Max. You want to have those points as reference as well. So I'll hit that. It'll create a few new nodes down here for us. So we've got this tracker point cloud is, like I said, it's all these 2D points converted into a 3D helper. We've got our camera, and then we've got an actual node for our scene as well. And just like in PF Track, we can toggle this to a 3D view here, and we can take a look at our scene. And usually I like to just jump over here and make sure that everything looks flat. We can check out from like a left view or a front view. And make sure that everything is not totally skewed or slanted. So check from the front as well. That's looking fine. And so we'll switch back to 2D here. So again, with this one, just like in PF Track, we need to kind of assign a ground plane for this as well. So in Nuke, it's slightly different. What we're going to do is just select some points that are on the plane that we want to use. So I'll just kind of shift drag around here, and I try to err on the side of getting more points than less.
But you can do things like having the horizon line on to check, having other context buildings that you know are accurate, the right scale and position. In this one, there's a lot of low buildings and not a lot of other features that we have built that we could match to, but even the one building helps a bit. You can go into some other views just to see that the points are kind of matching the right orientation. You'll have a few that are stray, which could have been bad tracks, or maybe they were following cars that didn't get masked out. But with so many points, even if you have some bad ones, it will work out fine. It's going to try to solve them as if they're static points. That's why it puts them underground, even though it might have tracked a moving car. To resolve that point with the rest of the solve, it will put them underground. But with enough points on the main ground plane, you should be fine. So most times you're not going to be able to just hit play in the viewport and preview things. So I'm sure most people have used the render from viewport, but I think they switch it in 2014.
They did.
Yeah, I think
It's in a different place.
it's in Tools, Preview, Grab Viewport now, and you can do great preview animation, and you can set various things, frame range, frame rate, output size, turning on different geometry and shapes and things like that. So with this, we could just do the background and the geometry, and just do it as even a wireframe. Should be fine. If you hit an AVI, it will create it and bring it up right in memory. But if you do custom file, is that 3000? Thanks. Yeah, AVI will bring it up in memory. You could save it after the fact, but custom file will allow you to save it off the bat. You can still switch it to, unfortunately, AVI is, I think, the only, you can do QuickTime here. So I don't know if it will work in 64-bit. I'm not going to render this out now because it might take a little just pulling all the frames through, but you're able to save the file out here. And I have a version that I already rendered out earlier. So this is what it spit out. Obviously, you get some shimmering with the wireframe, but you can see that the site is, one, it sticks. It doesn't slide throughout the shot, and it's not. That's one thing you want to look out for, and the other thing is if it's jittering at all, whether it's like high frequency, every frame jitters, or if there's big bumps in it, you can notice that here too. But also noticing the horizon line sticking pretty well. It's going to throw it off into space somewhere. That's okay. We can highlight the point that we want to link it to and copy the position track and paste that onto our patch. So it will align that position, and then from there you can just rotate things up. What are we doing? It's always a guessing game with this. We are not right. There we go. We'll just make these numbers a little nicer. So our corners stick, so if we scrub through, we'll notice that that patch is in 3D space, covering up that corner of the building, but we want to scale it up a little. And I've made this patch way too big. I kind of forgot how much of the cranes blocked it when I was putting it together, so I just got more than we need. I'm going to drop it down a little, and then from here, you can kind of just mask it off, roughly what you need. Maybe it'd be better to draw a straight line on one of the floors just to have it be a little nicer. So you'll fine-tune it a little here, just making sure the windows and everything line up, but actually sometimes you even need to scale it non-uniformly, so in this case we might want to.
We've got this example as well. I went through and did a bunch of small example scenes because a lot of these actual files are pretty slow to work with, but a lot of the examples I did are based off this film right here. Kill the sound on this as well. So things like boards kind of coming in like this, different pieces scaling out. Pieces folding out like this, kind of the curtain walls coming on in different ways, pieces folding out. For things like the slabs kind of sliding on like that around corners. So we're going to go through a bunch of those techniques, and then Matt will go through some more interior kind of techniques, and he'll talk about some of the rendering process as well. So I'm going to jump over into Max here. The first example that I've got is based off that boardwalk shot in the movie that we just took a look at, with the boards kind of sliding on like this. And there's a few different ways you could go about something like this. It's kind of hard to see up there on the screen, but if we take a look at
The floor is actually, I think, was done with a script, but more just to like a more robust script than the one that Vinny showed, but it was also just to get a little more control with something with that many pieces. You probably don't want to do it by hand every time. The examples we had showed thus far were a little smaller scale, or at least repeatable elements, but with that many individual floorboards, you probably want other scripts to help you out, but the underlying animation is still the same. It's just, you know, rotation, scale, and offsetting. Some of the more organic, like the rug, was a bend modifier, which I can show you that effect as well as how the curtains were done. But it's more about just going through the model and identifying kind of what pieces you have to work with, and just giving a little thought, like how would I break that up? How would I offset things and link things, and you know, what order should things come on in? But at the end of the day, the techniques used are pretty much the same for all of these things. You know, in this example, we had some pieces animating off, and then things animating on in their place, and it's just kind of that sleight of hand and offsetting the keys, just having the timing right, that sells it. And then in these last pieces were done in post, just with mattes and changing the color and texture in After Effects, just as a secondary layer. One other thing that so going back to a couple questions earlier about rendering, for this, what we did was we turned off all of the animated pieces and rendered the static room with the more traditional save to radiance map method, where you can do the pre-pass calculation, save that to a file, and then pull it from file when you render the main pass. And again, that was with all of the animated pieces off, so all the furniture and accessories. And then for the animated pieces, we just rendered them brute force and light cache. And I believe we also had the, you can see here, the camera motion blur on, V-Ray camera motion blur. Obviously, that's not ideal every time, doing brute force and motion blur. You know, it's going to jack up your render times quite a bit, but for a piece like this where the actual animation was 30 seconds, 35 seconds, we felt like it was worth it to use those higher settings, take a hit in render time. I mean, I don't know, I want to say maybe 2 or 3 hours a frame on these, with the brute force settings and the camera motion blur. And that was breaking it up into 2 passes. If we had the rest of the room on, brute forcing that as well would have been even higher, but since it was just the animated pieces, we're able to bring that time down a little bit. So let me jump into Max now. The final thing I just want to touch on quickly here, won't spend too much time on it, but just a quick explanation on the comping the two passes together. I mean, it may seem straightforward, but I just wanted to show you have obviously your beauty pass and then an animated pass. In this case, it was an animated people in car pass. And with the techniques we've done earlier, you're catching the shadows and also the reflections of the people in the glass storefront. You notice, I guess, at the beginning, you see those lighter gray is the reflection in the glass there. So you can just slap it on top and it will work because everything was matted out. But if you set up some multi-matte elements, you can separate the different channels. And in After Effects, you would do that with the set matte effect. And you can pull the different channels. So pull the red. It's just the red. And you can use a track matte on the people in car pass using an alpha matte mode. And now you have just the people, no cars, and also no shadows and reflections, just the people. So you can color correct them separately. You could duplicate that and then use matte from green channel instead. Now you have the cars. Duplicate that a third time and not use a track matte and put that under it. And then this would be your shadow control. So if I change the opacity, you can see that it's the shadow and reflection control. So just that simple setup, you can get the 3 layers out just with one render pass, or one time rendering it, because you get the multi-matte element for free. So you think, oh, I need the people and the cars and the shadows. Do you do it in one pass or multiple passes? You can set it up all in one pass and then break it back up in After Effects and have separate control over the different pieces. So, this was just 2, but you could set up, 10 multi-matte elements and have every person as a separate one. Or in the case of this animation, you could put each piece of furniture on a different matte and then have separate control over it from its shadows and the rest of the scene.